Hello and welcome back to What That Is Well. And this week we're going to discuss the great Epinal escape, which I'm of course are holding up here. That was written by Bowman. And last week we discussed the Indian contingent about Indian soldiers in the Second World War. And this week we're going to continue on this topic, and I made this a two-part because I feel like both of these topics matters and this should be discussed. And I read the book, of course, last week by the time we recorded this, and I just want to my first question, I suppose, is how is this not a movie? I mean, it has everything you want in a movie. It has the great World War II. It has a great escape. It has even romance in it, and it has the everything all the recipes you need for a good Hollywood movie. So how is this not a movie yet? It's beyond me.
Yeah, that's such a great question, and it's a question that I keep asking as well. And I'm hoping, I'm really hoping that it will be a movie. I've had some people who are interested in making a film, people in Britain and also people in South Asia, and I'm hopeful that it will become a movie because it absolutely is very visual. We've all, a lot of people have. I've seen the movie The Great Escape with Steve McQueen, or seen movies about Colditz and other prisoner of war camps and escapes. And there are a lot of visual elements that people will kind of will respond to. It's got the countryside where it takes place is very beautiful. There's those kind of there's airplanes coming over, there's bombing, there's beautiful girls, there's hiding.
What more do you need? What more do you need?
Exactly. What more do you need? It's perfect. Yeah. Definitely.
So let's begin with, because we're going to mainly talk about the camp of Epinal, but I want to talk a little bit about the POW camps as you do in the book as well. And I want to, because there are different types of POW camps. Not everyone was held together in one camp. There were different camps for, say, RAF fighter pilots, or for the Navy cadets, and for the army as well. So let's talk a little bit about different type of camps that you will find, and some of these we will talk about as well in this episode.
Yeah. Okay. So you've got what the Germans call the Auflag, which is the Offizierlager. So this is a camp for officers. And then you've got the Stalag, the Stammlager, which is a camp for not officers. And this would be and some of these were very big. So Stalag 8B, for example, which was in Lambdorf, very, very big camp, thousands and thousands of prisoners. And then the Stalag would often have little camps, work camps that were attached to it. So, because of course, one of the things about being a prisoner of war is that if you're not an officer, then you are expected to work. You're expected to work in this case, for the Germans. So the Germans did a lot of that. They would get the British and the Commonwealth and the American prisoners to work for them in farms and in factories and on the railways and so on. So they would have these little camps that were branch camps of the Stalag. And then you had the Stalag Luft, which was the camps for the RAF and for other air forces. And that's where the Great Escape came from, Stalag Luft 3, which was in the north, in the north of Germany, northeast. There was a camp just for sailors, so Milag Marlag in the north of Germany, not far from Hamburg. This was a camp that was for the Navy and the Merchant Navy, and there were some Indian soldiers there, some Indian sailors there. And then they had this thing called the Front Stalag. And the Front Stalag they were camps that were generally outside of Germany itself, but in other parts of the German Empire, so in France or in Poland. And these were the Front Stalag were usually for colonial soldiers. So we talked last week about colonial troops and how important they were. And the colonial soldiers that had been captured in 1940, the French ones, were held in these Front Stalags. And then also Epinal itself was Front Stalag 315. So that was the type of camp that it was, a Front Stalag.
Now, how did some of these Indian soldiers that were captured? Before I want to talk where were they captured from? Because some were captured in North Africa, and some you might have talked about last week were captured under the Dunkirk escape. So that's sort of a little bit about where they came from, how the logistic in putting in which camp to go where when they were captured, and the logistic behind this.
Mm. Well, so they were captured. So there were when Epinal was opened, which was in January 1944. There were 3,200 Indian soldiers there, and so it was a place where they brought together. The Germans concentrated together lots of Indians who had been in other camps, and the majority were captured in North Africa. So they had been in, at El Alamein or Tobruk. There was a large amount of Commonwealth troops who were captured at Tobruk, or Meshli, which was a smaller battle before that. Lots and lots of places they were captured, and they were then generally they were taken to Italy first. So they were looked after. The Italians had them. They were in camps in Italy. And then in September of 1943, the Italians capitulated, surrendered. And then there was a period of uncertainty for all of the Empire and Commonwealth prisoners of war in Italy, what was going to happen. And in fact, most of them were some of them escaped, and some of them managed to keep out of the German hands for months or years. But a lot of them were taken into Germany, and that's what happened to a lot of Indian prisoners. There were also a few who'd been captured elsewhere. So there were 300 who had been part of the story of my first book, part of Force K6, and they were captured in France after Dunkirk. They were captured in June of 1940. There were some who were captured in Greece. So when the Germans attacked, first the Italians and then the Germans attacked in 1941, there were a few Indians there. And there were even a few who had been part of the conflict in East Africa, in Ethiopia, and who had been captured there and transported to Italy and then to Germany. Not many of those, but a few. And then, of course, all of the sailors that I mentioned, who were in this special Milag Malag camp, they had been captured at sea. They had been on a ship that was sunk by the Germans, usually, and then the whole of the crew of that ship would be taken onto a German ship, a boat, and taken all the way back to Germany. So all over the place. I mean, they'd really kind of come all these different routes. And then, so they'd been in camps in different parts of Germany itself, or in Poland, or in France, or in Italy. And then in the beginning of 1944, the Germans decided to bring together many of these guys into this camp in Epinal itself.
Before we go into Epinal, I want to talk a little bit about conditions of other POW camps before, because you do spend time describing this in the book as well. And it wasn't all great conditions, especially the one in Italy sounded a little kind of miserable, especially for the Indian soldiers who were captured there. So let's talk a little bit about different conditions that they had to endure as POWs.
Yeah, some pretty tough conditions. So some of the time, those who were captured in North Africa, they were pretty badly treated to begin with, not fed very well, and sometimes ill treatment. Sometimes they were beaten up a bit. And then they were shipped across the Mediterranean from North Africa to Italy, and some of the conditions on those ships were really, really poor, really awful. And so, it was a kind of, quite a mixture, really. The thing that always made it okay was the Red Cross, and the Red Cross were really an extraordinary example and a really great thing for prisoners of war around the world. So the Red Cross, everywhere there were prisoners, so that might be in Germany, in Italy, but also in Britain or in Canada or in Japan, or everywhere. In India, in fact, there were quite a few German and Italian prisoners who ended up in India. Everywhere the Red Cross were there, and they would come and they would visit the camps, and they would look very carefully at the food and the health conditions and the, how much space these prisoners had. And so they were always there, and that was what kind of helped to make the conditions better for the prisoners. And that was true for the Indian prisoners in all of the camps they were in.
So let's talk about the transfer to Epinal, and because that as well, I've thought about it, was quite miserable train ride, I believe, to transporting the prisoners there as well.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, that's right. They were almost always by train, so although sometimes they, particularly later on, they were marching them along, on the roads. But the trains were the train conditions were not good. They would often be transported in cattle trucks rather than in carriages, and so you'd be sitting on the ground without proper toilets. And one or two of them were trying to escape, and one or two of them were successful in escaping. This kind of idea of escaping, I think, was always there as a possibility. And of course, the other aspect to this is that, and we talked about this last week, was the thing that was always there was that the Germans were always trying to recruit Indian soldiers to join this Legion Freies Indien, the Free Indian Legion that became the 950th Regiment of the German Army. And so there was always that kind of slight tension as well, that actually we may try to recruit you again. We may try and get you into the German army.
Whether some Indians try to join the Friar Corps and just to get a shot to escape, that they didn't really want to fight, but just wanted to try. And it was a better opportunity if you joined the Corps to escape in that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was calculations. I think these Indian prisoners of war were like any prisoner of war. They were thinking, okay, how can I be safe here? What can I do? In some cases they escaped immediately, and there's some really interesting stories from North Africa of soldiers like a Gurkha who walked, several hundred miles, escaping from the Germans. So sometimes they did that. Sometimes they just kind of thought, yeah, okay, so they want. If I join the German army, I'll get better treatment. They'll feed me better, and I won't be in this kind of locked up, and maybe I'll have the chance to kind of do something, and earn some money. And then, of course, a lot of them just kind of did what most people do in life, which is just to kind of follow along. They just kind of went along with, did what they were told, and they just kind of endured it and went with their friends and kind of said, okay, I'm just going to see what happens. So, yeah, I think it's really interesting and really difficult to kind of try and imagine the mentality, of these guys,
I mean, try to put yourself in their shoes and see how you would endure. Just what would your mentality be if you were in their condition?
Exactly. And I think that's, I've never been in prison. I'm very thankful for that, And one of the interesting things about being a prisoner of war is that if you do a crime, if you steal something and go to jail, then you'll be there for 6 months or 18 months or whatever. If you're a prisoner of war, there's no limit. There's no kind of end point. The only thing is
it wasn't like they knew the war would end in 1945, and then it was just a 3-year time thing.
Exactly, and of course, not all the prisoners came home immediately at the end of the war as well. You didn't even when the war finished, they weren't. Some of the German prisoners, for example, who were in the Soviet Union, they didn't come home till quite a lot later. So yeah, there's no kind of sense of having any idea of when this is going to finish, and that must be really difficult. I think it seems to me sometimes that the psychological and the mental problems that these guys have had are probably just as big as any kind of physical issues that they had.
So let's talk a little bit about Epinal, the camp itself, and the arrival of soldiers and what they had to do in the camp as POWs in there.
So the camp itself is on the top of a hill, up above Epinal, the town. Epinal is a small I guess you could call it a small city or a large town in the northeast of France. It's on the river Moselle, so it's quite close to the German frontier. You've got this river Moselle, which has got the railway and the road running along it. And then to the east of that, you've got these mountains called the Vosges Mountains, not very big mountains, but kind of hills. And then on the other side of that, you've got the River Rhine, and then there's Germany. And the camp was built as a barracks for French soldiers in the 1880s. So it's these big buildings, sort of quite high buildings around a sort of square, a central parade ground, and they turned it into the Germans turned it into a prisoner of war camp, and the Indians arrived in the beginning of 1944, and they had different blocks. So again, like we said before, the policy is to divide the Indian soldiers into different religions or different language groups. So there was a block for the Sikhs, there was a block for the Hindus, there was a block for the Muslims, and then also there were other types of soldiers, but they were separated out. I think it was quite a good camp. It wasn't an awful camp, but it was okay. All of the soldiers all the prisoners there were no officers. They were all NCOs, sergeant majors and so forth, and privates. And they had reasonable medical care. And again, you can see this very strongly and very clearly from the Red Cross reports. So the Red Cross came and visited, and they also took photos. There's lots of really interesting photos of the camp. The Red Cross visited in February, and it was snowing. And so there's a photo of some of the guys playing football in the snow, which I think is quite brave. And then photos of some of them inside, cooking. And then there's a photo of the medical team. And they had two doctors at this stage, one who was Indian, one who was British. Later, they had a third doctor as well.
If I may, let's talk about being a doctor for a few minutes, because again, you do this in the book as well. Because being a doctor was quite, I believe, different. If you could actually keep practicing as a doctor inside the POW camp, because I needed doctors to look after and there was quite a few numbers. I believe 3,000 wasn't there 3,000 prisoners that were divided on all these doctors in the camp. So they had quite a job ahead of them. But they were allowed to keep practicing as doctors, as POWs as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So 3,000 prisoners, 2 doctors. That's a lot. That's a lot of that's a lot of patients per doctor. Yeah. And so all of the medical, if you were a doctor in the army and you were captured, then you were expected to continue being a doctor. And equally, if you were a medical technician, or if you were a dentist, or if you were a nurse, or any kind of health professional, then you were expected to keep doing that job while you were in the prisoner of war camp. And you can see that in that photo. You can see the 2 doctors. You can see the other medical staff in that photo. They had no dentist in Epinal, and that was a bit of a problem. So they started to go to visit a French dentist in the town down the hill. And actually, that turned out to be a really good thing, because later, after the escape, the French dentist was very helpful in helping them escape. So that was lucky. But so the conditions were okay, and the food was okay, and they were it's not perfect, but it could have been a lot worse.
Before we go into the escape itself, I want to talk a little bit about what that they were doing. You mentioned they were playing football, for example, but being a POW wasn't always a great lot of fun. It was a lot of boring times as well, especially if you were perhaps an officer and you didn't have to do work, and not like the normal soldiers and privates were. So there was a lot of downtime as well. And so let's talk a little bit about spending time as a POW and others, what you actually did during Epinal and as the time you spent there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a big part of the prisoner of war experience during the Second World War was this kind of boring time, you know. So a lot of them had to work. Okay, not so much in Epinal. In fact, I haven't found any evidence that the prisoners in Epinal were working, but the Germans would have been allowed to ask them to work and to make them work, but I haven't found any evidence yet. But I know that in other prisoner of war camps, the Indian prisoners of war were working very hard in bakeries, in farms, working in factories, making rubber things and repairing things, all sorts of jobs. But in Epinal, they weren't. So, yeah, a lot of downtime, a lot of boring time, a lot of time. I mean, writing letters, certainly. And interestingly, there's a couple of the prisoners of war at Epinal who were postmen. So they were kind of soldier postmen who'd been attached to what were called field post offices. Who were actually, handling letters to India and back from India. And so they were looking after that side of the mental health, I guess, of the prisoners.
Was there censorship when it came to writing letters? Were there things they weren't allowed to say, or was there things you couldn't? I don't know. That
That's
were
a really good.
heavily.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there was an issue there in that the Germans, yes, they looked at every letter coming in and every letter going out. And of course, the Germans didn't have people who could read or write Indian languages. So they tried to make sure that the Indian soldiers were only writing in English and that their relatives at home were only writing in English. But that wasn't always successful. So that became a bit of a problem for the Germans trying to understand what was being written. But yeah, there was definitely censorship. Absolutely. Yeah. So, they're reading letters, they're writing letters, they're praying, and so they're setting up in each barrack. There's a Muslim prayer room, or there's a really good photo actually of the Sikh prayer room in one of the other camps, and they're reading. They were sent lots of books, and there's a nice photo of the library in one of the other prison camps. And then there's music, and sometimes they are kind of putting on plays like you see in the movies about British prisoners of war. There was certainly some drama that was being done by Indian prisoners in other prison camps. Yeah, and trying to keep themselves occupied and just kind of trying to keep themselves sane. I think really, how can we not go mad? In this situation, the situation where we don't know how long we're going to be here, we don't know what's going to happen to us. We're kind of completely restricted. How do we keep ourselves sane?
So we're going to talk about the May 11th bombing very soon, but I want to talk about there were attempts even before the May 11th bombing to try to escape. So let's talk a little bit about the escape attempt pre May 11th bombing and how very successful were these attempts?
Well, there was no successful escape from Epinal before that, but the thing was that a lot of these guys had been in other camps, and a lot of them had they'd either escaped themselves or they had heard about friends who'd escaped. So like in Italy, when the in September of '43, when the Italians stopped fighting, quite a few Indians escaped and hid in the mountains and were looked after by Italian peasants. For some cases for quite a number of months, and so they had this idea that it was possible. They had this idea that that we could do this. There are other stories of guys who escaped when they were on the train going to Epinal. They escaped and were recaptured. And we know that there were some guys in Epinal who had maps and even had a compass. They had they had this escaping idea. They had this mentality, if you like. They had this possibility in their head that we can do this. But there hadn't been any successful escape attempts from Epinal before May the 11th.
Before May 11th, I want to talk a little bit about the guards who were guarding as well, the POW camps, and even Epinal as well, and as other camps. Because these were the creme de la creme soldiers, the elite. soldiers that were, you'd imagine it was kind of little B or C soldiers, if you will. They were the top dog of the German army.
And the German army was kind of, had these kind of hierarchies and these levels, so yeah, the prison camp guards were never as you say, the creme de la creme. They were just kind of, often they were guys who were older, maybe they'd been even in the First World War, maybe they were that old, sometimes they were guys who had, special skills like languages, for example, and they were kind of there to, to translate or even to spy on the prisoners. But it was, I guess on the other hand, it's also a kind of, it's a fairly safe option. It's not, you're not being on the Eastern Front, or, you're not kind of facing the enemy in Italy. You're in a relatively safe place, just kind of looking after these prisoners, and you think you're safe. And that's interesting, that kind of idea of looking after, because I think for some guards, and I've looked at quite a few different accounts in different camps, Italians and Germans. For some of them, there was a real sense that actually, yes, they were looking after these people. They were kind of, they were sort of almost protecting them in a way, and they had to kind of make sure that, yes, they had to make sure they didn't escape, but they also had to make sure that they ate. They had to make sure that they were healthy. They had to make sure that they were, that when the Red Cross came to visit every few months, that they looked okay. So it's a funny kind of job being a prisoner of war camp guard.
Again, you mentioned food, and we talked about this in the last episode as well, when it comes to the British Army provided food for all these different religions like Sikh, Hindu, etc. How was this? Was this an easy job for? Like we said last time, there are Sikhs, Muslims, Gurkhas, all these different religions in the POW camps. So how were they able to find out? Were they already reading up on who were allowed to eat? Did they care about this, or was it not that important for the Germans? What in respect to religion when it came to food and food supply to the Indian POWs?
Yeah, the Germans were quite aware of the need to try and meet the dietary requirements, and again, that's partly because of the Red Cross, partly because of the Swiss, the visitors who were coming every few months. So, for example, so Muslims can't eat meat unless it's been killed in the halal manner. So, and they, in fact, there was a correspondence between a prisoner of war camp and some religious authorities in India about exactly how that should be interpreted. So were they allowed to eat fish? Tinned fish. What about different types of meat? And the guidance that came back from India was you have to have the meat has to be killed by the prisoners in the right way. And of course, on top of that was the whole question of food parcels. So there was actually an organisation set up in London called the Indian Comforts Fund, and the Indian Comforts Fund was responsible for making these parcels, these little boxes of food that were sent via Lisbon, and then to Geneva, and then to the camps. And they had food that was particularly the Indian prisoners of war were looking for. So, for example, flour that you can make chapatis from, curry powder, and other types of spices, and indeed tins, different types of tins of meat and cheese. And so, yeah, absolutely, the whole question of the food that suited the particular prisoners was really important for the Germans and for the British and for the Red Cross. Yeah.
I want to mention this in this episode and not instead of the last one. That it's interesting that the Germans kind of view the Indians as fellow Aryans. I believe that the term Aryan as well arrives from India, so they kind of view them as equal because they had Aryans, and then you had like you said, they had hierarchy on the race where the Jews were the lowest, the Slavs, and then they were pretty subhumans in the Germans' view. But the Indians, interesting enough, they were viewed as fellow Aryans.
Yeah, and that's so weird, Arlen. That is just so weird. That this whole kind of, and the Nazi project was built around racism. That was kind of central to their whole ideology. And as you say, the hierarchies and this idea of the Untermensch, subhumans, it's just completely, it seems so strange now, but actually, there are still people in Europe and elsewhere, still people who carry this kind of idea, that there are these levels, these hierarchies, and that some people are not.
Growing even today, and especially when it comes to modern immigration, you see this, that from third world countries, you see the growing that they view them as less worthy of than themselves in modern world.
Yeah. So the Germans had prisoners from all over. They had Soviet prisoners, and those Soviet prisoners included Muslims as well from Central Asia. They had prisoners from across the French Empire, from North Africa, from West Africa, from Southeast Asia. They had prisoners from across Europe, Poles, Dutch, French, everybody, Greeks. And then they had prisoners from across the British Empire, which included, Southern Africa, East Africa, West Africa, and then India in large numbers, but also people like Jews from Palestine who had been in, who had emigrated from Germany or Austria, that emigrated to Palestine and joined the British Army and had been captured. And now we're kind of in this terrible position, they
weren't treated too bad because they feared the Red Cross and that would go back to haunt them with their own German POWs in Canada or Britain, so they weren't treated too. The Jews were surprisingly treated. I wouldn't say well, but they were treated better than in the concentration camps, at least.
Yes, exactly. And the important thing here was the uniform. So if they were wearing a khaki uniform, if you were a guy from Tel Aviv wearing a khaki uniform, or if you were from Toronto or from Sydney or from South Africa, if you were wearing a khaki uniform, then you were treated more or less like a British prisoner. And that was the thing that was, that made it kind of better. But this very clear hierarchy. And then, as you say, this strange, this one of the founding things of Nazism was that this idea of the Aryan race, and that those people had come from northern India, and migrated across Asia and across Europe and settled in northern Europe, and that therefore there was a strong relationship between blonde-haired German guys and dark-haired, dark-skinned guys from North India. That was the idea. And so, yes. And of course, the swastika, the symbol, the swastika was originally an Indian symbol. It kind of actually comes from other places as well, but was very strong in Hindu mythology and still is, very present in Hindu iconography. So, this kind of idea that the Germans and the Nazi Germans and the Indians were connected meant that there was in some parts of the Nazi hierarchy, there was quite a lot of sympathy, and there was this idea of trying to make strong relationships with India. And there was this thing in Berlin at the beginning of the war, the what was it called, the Zentrum Freies Indien, the Free India Center, which was a number of Indian intellectuals and scholars who had been in Germany before the war, who kind of got together and started doing radio broadcasts, for example, to India in different languages, and also then recruiting Indian prisoners into the German army, or trying to do that, and all kinds of different activities to make that link between Germany and India, and to kind of break the power of the British Empire, because that was always Hitler's. One of Hitler's big things was always, the British have this enormous empire, and we Germans need an empire. So
let's talk about the May 11th bombing, because that's where it all begins, and the great Epinal escape starts, of course. And let's talk about how essential this bombing were. And it was also devastating as well because fellow Allied soldiers were killed in the bombing. So let's talk about how it's obvious how it made it easy to escape. But let's talk a little bit about the May 11th bombing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. So the Americans and the British are bombing across northern France, Belgium, Germany, as part of the preparation for D-Day. So D-Day was planned. Well, D-Day happened on June the 6th. So this is about 4 weeks before that, and they were every night the Americans were bombing different parts of the railway network. That was the idea, was they were trying to disrupt the railway network before D-Day, so that it would be more difficult for the Germans to reinforce their armies in northern France. And on May the 11th, the Americans attacked, and the Americans always did their air raids during the day. The Royal Air Force went at night time, but the Americans went in the daytime. And on May the 11th, they attacked Epinal and some other towns and cities near there in the east of France, Nancy and Belfort. And they came over in the afternoon. It was about 3:30 in the afternoon. A very large number of bombers, and they were aiming for the railway station, the railway lines, the marshalling yards, the whole kind of railway infrastructure, which is down the hill from the prisoner of war camp. It's about a mile. It's not very far. And so they dropped loads of bombs on the town, on the railway, but they weren't all of them completely accurate. This is, it's not precision bombing. The idea was that it was precision bombing, but it wasn't. And a lot of the bombs fell on the prisoner of war camp, and very quickly. And in fact, the guy who was the man of confidence. So every prisoner of war camp, there was somebody who was elected by the prisoners to be their sort of in-between guy with the Red Cross. And this guy was called Bhagat Ram. He was a sergeant, and he wrote to the afterwards. He wrote to the Red Cross and he said, "We were playing football." He said, so there was a football match between the Marathas and the Sikhs at 3:30 in the afternoon, and suddenly we heard the sound of these bombers, and we thought, when they were used to hearing bombers going overhead, but they were not used to having the bombers dropping bombs on them. And so suddenly, there's bombs dropping on the buildings, in the courtyard, all around, and very quickly it gets very bloody and very chaotic and very awful destruction. And in fact, so there were 58 Indian prisoners of war were killed on that day, but also more than 200 French civilians, and also, of course, some of the German guards as well. So quite appalling destruction. And it's kind of, it is kind of strange when you think, okay.
If I may, would you consider this kind of being a war crime in a way?
I'm
not sure. A lot of civilians were killed, and when you have your own POWs killed, and it's
I'm not sure I would call it a war crime, Harlan, but I would definitely say it's kind of really odd. It's really peculiar that the Americans are bombing a French town. They're bombing their allies in the prisoner of war camp, and they're trying to do that in order to stop the Germans. I think it's not. I've looked really carefully at the plans for the bombing, and at the intelligence reports that they had, and it's not clear to me whether the Americans actually knew that there was a POW camp there. I think on the whole they probably didn't, but also their bombing was not as accurate as it should have been. So it's kind of it's kind of really it's kind of ironic, really deeply ironic at the very least, that they were bombing the camp.
So that's the escape itself then. And sorry if I interrupt you, but that's sort of what the Indian escape did, because it was just of a mass escape. Because obviously, who wouldn't take the opportunity to escape when the bombs were kind of distracting and everyone was thinking about something else? So why wouldn't you try to escape? So let's talk about how this opportunity arrived for the Indian POWs and everyone, the other POWs for that matter.
Yeah. Exactly. Why wouldn't you escape? You're absolutely right. And in fact, in some cases, the Germans told them to get out of the camp because it would be safer, outside, because these bombs were still dropping. But yeah, absolutely. So there was this initial confusion in the afternoon, and some guys saw that this was an opportunity immediately and started, to grab some things and run. Other guys were kind of held overnight in the camp or just outside the camp and took the opportunity the next day. But I think a lot of them had kind of at least had the idea in mind. If it does happen, if I do get the opportunity to escape, what am I going to take? And some of them just kind of made up their minds on the spot and started running. And the to the west of the camp. So I've been to the place where the camp was, and I've seen the remaining buildings, and I've looked at the territory very carefully. So to the west of the camp, there was this field that slopes down gently, and then and they ran across that, and then it goes down to a sort of a kind of stream, and then there's a little lake, and then you go further west, and then there is thick forest, and then there's also some, and around that are some sort of suburbs, some villages and suburban settlements. So I think they were, and of course the French civilians, were very aware of what was happening, and a lot of cases were immediately very helpful. And we'll talk more in a minute about how helpful the French were. But yeah, so they're kind of running down the hill. They are kind of in this terrible panic. Some of the Germans are shooting, some of the Germans are not. There's a kind of, I think the Germans were as confused as anyone else, really. And they are starting to think, okay, here's this thick bit of woodland. Let's go and hide in there. And how do we get safe? And I think quite a lot of them knew that Switzerland was not very far away. And they knew that Switzerland was, of course, neutral, and they knew in which direction.
Let's talk a little bit about this for 1 second, because what was the geographical knowledge for the Indian POWs? How did they have to study the geographical area on maps and see how far away? What was the distance between Epinal and Switzerland? How far would it take to go? Even back in those days, I mean, today we probably have better conditions with better roads and better transport system. But if you were a POW, you had to get to the safe zone. How easy was it back in 1944 to travel from Epinal to and at a distance from there to Switzerland?
So it's about 100 kilometers, maybe a little bit more, from Epinal to the nearest bit of the Swiss frontier, the town of Delle. And
still quite far.
Yeah. So I mean, I can, I've driven that distance in a few hours, but to walk took them days. I think the knowledge. It's an interesting question about the geographical knowledge. I think that there was probably, a few of them had an idea about which direction and how far, and I think a lot of them didn't. But they were all relying on help. They were walking together. In some cases in small groups, but in some cases quite big groups. I've heard reports of like 30 or 40 of them marching together through the woods and along the streams. And
wouldn't that make it easier to be captured if you were working together instead of splitting up?
Yeah, absolutely. And quite a lot of them were recaptured, and that was a big issue. And one of the things about that, so the on the day after the raid on May the 12th, the Germans put out a notice in the local paper, in the French newspaper, saying, if you help these guys, you will be shot. So it was really from the beginning, it was a very clear, hard line from the Germans. So, and the funny, that's kind of another funny thing about that. So if you were a prisoner of war, escaped prisoner of war, recaptured, you would be taken back to the prisoner of war camp or another prisoner of war camp. But if you were a French civilian who helped them, you would be shot. And that makes it extraordinary that so many French civilians did help them, and was incredibly generous towards them. But yeah, there were a lot of them were recaptured and taken to, well, some of them to Epinal, but mostly to other camps, because of course Epinal was still in this kind of bombed state. Yeah.
It's interesting. If I remember if I remember correctly, Marshal Pétain, who was of course the chief of France, ruled France at the time, took advantage of this bombing and tried to turn propaganda against the Allies to use this bombing incident as for Vichy France to boost the morality for the German effort.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. And that was definitely for Pétain and for the other Vichy French rulers and the collaborationists. This was definitely something that they could use to strengthen their cause. Was to say, here we are, but the Americans and the British are bombing us. That they are our enemies. I mean, it was difficult. In the summer of 1944, D-Day was coming up. People knew that D-Day was coming up, but there's a lot of mixed feelings in France about which way they should be leaning now, which way they should be, fighting on, how they should be involved.
So let's talk about let's go back to the escape, and we talked about because like you said, surprisingly, quite a few were helping these Indian soldiers trying to reach the border of Switzerland, but there were quite a few as well who chose to remain in the woods and tried to. Some even joined the resistance, the Maquis as well. So that's actually the different choices some of these Indian soldiers would make after they would try to escape.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so some of them, yeah, absolutely. There's some good stories about guys who joined in with the French resistance, and one who became a member of a bunch of silent killers, and who had something like 11. He would go around just attacking, and killing German soldiers, and got a medal for that. And then a sergeant a Gurkha sergeant who joined a very strong Maquis camp in the kind of further south, south of Belfort, where there was a big pitched battle later on between the German army and the French resistance. And another one another Indian soldier, Jailal, who claimed to have started a resistance group, but that's another story. But yeah, the French were really, and hiding in woods in quite large numbers, for long periods of time, and getting incredible support. When I was earlier this year, I was in Epinal and I did a talk at the library, and a woman came up to me afterwards and she said that her mother remembered baking bread and supplying a large group of Indian soldiers, like 70 or so, who were living near their farm for a number of weeks, and how she looked after them every day. And I just think that's amazing that these French farmers and civilians kind of opened their hearts to these strange guys who didn't speak any French and who, were from a country thousands of miles away and they had a different religion, and they just kind of, they were just so generous towards them. It's amazing.
Like you said earlier, it's interesting that they were so helpful, considering they knew the risk if they were caught doing this, that they would get shot. So it's quite interesting how helpful they actually were towards this Indian, and it's almost heartwarming to see that they took this risk to help. Then someone helped drive them to the borders of Switzerland as well, I believe. So it's almost hard. It's a little heartwarming to read all this help that they received after escaping Epinal.
Yeah, I agree. Heartwarming is a good word. I think that's part of what I wanted to do in writing this book to some extent was to remind people to tell people in India and South Asia that these things had happened and these French people had been so generous, and to tell people here in Europe also, in Norway, in Britain, but also in France, just to remind them and to help them remember that there was this incredible, like a network, really. It really was like a network. And in some cases, it was a formal network of support and sustenance and feeding and, taking them along the paths, and looking after them, in this very generous way at a time that was a very difficult time in France. And there was this guy called Jules Perret, and he's a really good example. So Jules Perret, he was a quite an old guy. He'd been in the First World War himself, as fighting, and he was the blacksmith in this little village called Etebon, and he lived there with his wife. He had two sons, one of whom was a prisoner of war. He had a grandson, and he had lots of other relatives around him and friends, and in this small village, and he was kind of very. The reason one of the reasons he's so interesting is because he kept a journal, he kept notes, and what he would do, he didn't have a big book that he wrote in every day. He kind of wrote things on little pieces of paper, and then he hid them away. And then after the war, he gathered together all these little pieces of paper and wrote it into a proper journal, and it's absolutely fascinating. And it's part of the reason it's so fascinating is because it mixes up the kind of the stories of what's happening in the war. So he says that in Yugoslavia the partisans are advancing, and the Americans bombed such and such a place last night, and also we have harvested 10 kilos of potatoes, and we've made 3 big bottles of cherry brandy. So it's this kind of stuff that's all mixed in together, which is really interesting, and it kind of gives you an idea of what his life was like. And he first met some of the Indian escapees just a few days after the bombing, and he's going around along the road with some cows and with his grandson Philippe. And actually, I met his grandson Philippe. And suddenly, around the corner come these 9 soldiers, these men dressed in khaki, and he's really surprised to see them. But instantly, he goes to help them. He gives them some food, and he takes them to the village, and he takes them to the presbytère, the place where the priest lives. This is a Protestant village, so it's a Protestant vicar, and he starts to look after them. And they were the first of many who came through that village. I mean, literally hundreds who came through that village, and lots of people in the village remember them and tell the stories now. Even today, even now, there are still people who were alive then, who were children then, who can remember them.
It's interesting that you said earlier, considering the risk that you said that you had to take to help them. There seemed to be very little to almost no betrayal among those who helped the Indian POWs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there were people across that part of France who were collaborating with the Germans. There was the militia, who was on the side of the Germans, who were French guys, and there were others who were collaborating. But yeah, I haven't really found any stories of betrayal. So I think it was quite something. It really was quite amazing. And then there's some other, as they get further and further towards the frontier, the people are actually taking them along, escorting them along the paths. And there's these two, for example, there's two teenage girls who live in one family. The farm is called the Coin du Bois, the Woody Corner farm, and they escort groups of these soldiers, these escaping soldiers, every night, and they're always careful to be taking them on slightly different routes through the fields so that they don't kind of make these big paths, which would be really visible. And these two teenage girls, after the liberation, after the Allies had arrived, they got a certificate from their local resistance saying, well done, you helped 67 of these guys escape, and congratulations and thank you. Just amazing, just amazing that two, teenage girls were doing that kind of level of support and help and self-sacrifice.
There's also, I'm not going to try to say his name because I'm probably going to get it wrong anyway. But there's also this one soldier, and that you mentioned I want to bring up as well, that were hiding in a barn. We talked about Romans earlier, and he sees, and you are doubtful on the truth of this story and how reliable it is, because it does lie a bit in the story as well. So let's talk a little bit about the guy, the soldier who hides in a barn and meet a girl who's, I believe, he marries, claims to marry and have children with. You found no evidence of this, surprisingly.
It's
So,
it's a fascinating story. Yeah. So the guy, his name is Jay Lal. He was a Lance Naik, which means a Lance Corporal in the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. He was captured in North Africa. He was in camps in Italy, and then he was in Epinal, and he escaped with the rest of the guys. And he was escaping on his own, so he wasn't in a group. And yes, exactly. He found a little barn, and he fell asleep in some hay, and he was woken by a dog. This is the story that he later told the journalist when he was back in India. So he was woken by a dog, and then next to the dog was a beautiful young girl called Denise Nede, who was 16 or so. And she woke him up and she said, you've escaped from Epinal. And he said, no, I haven't escaped from Epinal. He said, I'm an Indian Army officer, and I'm here to organize the resistance, which was not true. And so, according to his story, then he got the two brothers, Denise's two brothers, to start a resistance group, and they started to attack German convoys and trains and so forth. And then, according to him, he married Denise in the church, and even they had a baby. And this was such an interesting story, and this story was written. So he was given the Indian Order of Merit, which is a medal, which was a very high grade medal. It was just kind of second to the Victoria Cross at that stage. And so that's where this story comes from. It's from his medal citation, and from the stories that he told when he was back in India to the army newspaper. So I was fascinated by this, and I kind of wanted to find out. So I was in India last year researching, and I wanted to find his family, and I managed to find his family with a lot of help and a lot of tweets and a lot of support from various people. And we went, my wife was with me in India, and we went to interview his family. We found their village, and we found his three sons, and we had a fascinating conversation with them. And they kind of they had the same story that he did, really, which is that he had kind of started this resistance group, that he'd married Denise, that they'd had two children, according to them, but that Denise had stayed in France, and the two children had stayed in France, even though they wanted to get them to come to India, and that Jailal, their father, had married an Indian woman, and that these three sons were the product of that marriage. But also, they also had another, and they showed me kind of documents and photos of medals and so on. But the medal, the Indian Order of Merit, which was the big, most important medal, they said that a few years before, some men from the Indian government had come and kind of wanted to look at it, and had taken away this medal and never brought it back. So basically, they'd stolen it from the family, which was terrible.
yeah, but
So that was
again, you said in the book as well, that was an entirely uncommon thing to happen with war memorabilia in India.
Yeah, and and it's not kind of, again, there's a sense that maybe this family were looking after some of the things that they had from Jalal. They had a big picture of him up on the wall and so on, but not everyone necessarily sees those things as important. Yeah. So then we went to France. So we were in India, and then we went to France, and we went to that village. We went to the villages where Denise Nede had lived, and where her family had lived, and found some of the family still there. So a cousin and a nephew, and we asked them, okay, so what do you remember? What happened to this guy? And what's the truth here? And we looked in the local office, the mayor office, for a register, of the births and the deaths and the marriages. And there was no register of any marriage, and there was no register of any births. And the family said, yeah, there was definitely we remember this soldier, but there was no wedding, and he was just he wasn't leading the resistance the resistance group here. They didn't even remember him as being part of the resistance group. The resistance group was just a kind of a French thing, And Pierre Nede, who was Denise's brother, was very, he'd kind of written about it, or rather, he'd talked to the newspaper about it before he died. So yeah, it was a really interestingly strange versions of the story. So you've got the kind of British version of the story that was in the medal citations, and then you've got the Indian version that came through his story and through his family, and then you've got the French story, and they didn't agree. The three stories didn't agree with each other, and that's really difficult for me as a historian, is to try and find my way through that, and to make some kind of judgment about what is the truth here. And of course, the truth, it's not clear. It really isn't clear what the truth is. But it's just clear. It was clear to me that everybody has a reason for giving their version. That's what it is.
So let's talk about reaching the border of Switzerland, and actually, because it can be, especially in these areas you described, to be confusing, especially for if you were an Indian POW, you didn't really know the area. It was hard to find out what side was Switzerland, what side was France or Germany, because they had all these borders crossing this area, so it was quite difficult. There was no clear exact border at this point in time, at least, I believe. So let's talk a little bit about actually crossing the border and into the safe zone of Switzerland.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some cases it was quite confusing, and in some cases they would be taken right up to the border and across the border by these French civilians who were helping them. In other cases, they were on their own. There are these kind of, in some cases there's barbed wire, and then these stones on the border between, in fact, all the way around Switzerland, they have these clear stones that mark the edge of the country. But if you don't know about those stones, then that doesn't necessarily help you. So yeah, it was difficult, and some guys were shot at and recaptured on the border. Some guys crossed over into Switzerland and didn't realize they were in Switzerland. In some case, and also the Swiss border guards, a lot of them speaking German. And a lot of them, the uniforms are not necessarily that different from the German uniforms. So it's kind of, it was quite difficult and confusing. And there was quite a lot of risk, right up until the last moment. There's this one wonderful place where there's a big mansion. There was this rich family who were tobacco manufacturers in Switzerland. They were called the Roux family, and they made cigarettes. And he's got this big mansion right on the border, and then he's got this gate which is literally on the border, and it's called the Porte de France, the gate to France. And there were two keys for this gate that were held on the French side by the different resistance group members. So they came up to the gate, and they opened the gate with the key and opened it wide, and then you could step through, and you were in freedom. You were in Switzerland. So that must have been quite a wonderful feeling to do that. And then they were in Switzerland, and then they were, the Swiss border guards and the customs officials welcomed them, and there's lots of photos taken around those times in different parts of the frontier, guys arriving. And then, of course, they had to be registered, so everyone who came across the border, they made a little card, and I've seen those cards in the Swiss National Archives. They made a little card that says the name and the rank and the regiment and when he entered Switzerland, but also it's interesting because they write down where he's from in India and the names of his family members as well, which is really interesting in terms of kind of connections to today. Yeah. And so, and the numbers are extraordinary, Erlend. So there were 3,000 prisoners in Epinal, about 800 escaped, and 500 reached Switzerland, which is an enormous number, absolutely enormous number, and way more than any other prisoner of war escape of the Second World War. So it's the biggest, most successful escape of the Second World War, full stop.
So let's talk a little bit about actually being and spending your time in Switzerland, because some would like to ski and some would learn to try to integrate into their society, but also when they came into Switzerland, they were started to stay in hotels, but eventually there would be so many, like you said, so they were eventually started to end up in, ironically, in camps from that they always escaped from. But this would of course be a difference from the
Mm,
POW camp. So let's talk a little bit
mm,
about actually their time in Switzerland as well.
mm, mm. Yeah, yeah, and there were large numbers, as you say, and over 500 of them. But also, of course, there were also very large numbers of escapees and soldiers from all different nationalities who were taking refuge in Switzerland. So, back in 1940, there were large amounts of French and Polish who took refuge in Switzerland. By this time, by 1944, there were lots of flyers, lots of aircrew from America and the RAF who had kind of escaped or who had landed their aircraft in Switzerland. Maybe their aircraft had been shot down and they'd managed to get to Switzerland and they kind of got out. There were lots of POWs who'd come up from Italy, who'd escaped, in Italy, come across the southern border. And so, the Swiss were very used to looking after large amounts of foreign soldiers, also including Germans as well. I mean, from all over. So they were used to looking to having camps for large amounts of foreign soldiers who, in some cases, they didn't share a language with, because of course the Swiss speak French, Italian, German, and another Romansh language as well. And so initially the Indians were in the north of Germany, so in the north of Switzerland, the German speaking area, and divided into different camps. And again, lots of great photos of them there, and some interesting reports by the Swiss authorities. And then they were all concentrated together right down in the southeast corner, which is the Italian area. So they were taken to a place called Lozone, which is a little sort of border, a little village, really, I guess, very close to the Italian border. And there they were all concentrated together. So 500 and a few more than 500, because there were also some other prisoners of war who'd escaped before that from other camps as well, with some really interesting stories among them.
If I may, this might be a weird question, but where everyone who tried to enter Switzerland accepted, or were there some that were turned back? Because Sweden as well were a neutral country, and a lot of Norwegians and maybe English soldiers as well would escape to Sweden, but not everyone necessarily in Sweden, because then again, Sweden were very pro-German, that and pretty much a puppet state of Germany. So they sent some of those back, even if they knew they would send them back to death. So was it the case in Sweden where not everyone were actually welcomed to the Switzerland, or in Sweden? Was this the case in Switzerland as well? Or that were some people that were sent back, even though they knew where they would send them to?
That's really interesting. That's an interesting parallel. As you say, Sweden was neutral, Switzerland was neutral. No, but in Switzerland, no, they weren't turned back. None of the Indians were turned back anyway. I mean, I know that there were Jews who were trying to escape from different places, including from Germany, who were not, before the war as well, who were not necessarily accepted into Switzerland. So but for the Indians, they were all accepted. They were all taken in, and kind of looked after. And that's really, that's kind of, they were well treated by the Swiss. And there's this. It's one of the interesting things that I found when I was in Switzerland was that there's this tradition of neutrality, but also this tradition of welcoming, and hosting soldiers from other armies, which goes back all the way to 1870. So way before even the First World War. Yeah. So they were they were all taken together to this camp in the southeast, and they spent the summer there. And also now at this stage, they had some British officers, so officers who had been in the Indian Army, who had been prisoners of war themselves, captured in different places, and had escaped themselves. And they were kind of then put in charge of these of these Indian soldiers. So it's almost like a little kind of part of the Indian army in Switzerland. And yeah, they were okay. They were meeting Swiss people. They were making relationships. There's some good stories about friendships, and even little bits of romance again, and yeah, kind of being accepted and. But as you say, they were still in a camp. So even though it was a different sort of camp and it was a different kind of relationship, nevertheless, but then that's what it's like in the army as well. You're in a barracks, you're being fed, it's kind of, there's always this kind of element of regimentation, of official organization for you.
So let's talk about the end of the war and what they were doing after the war, because like you said, not everyone went back to India immediately. Some stayed behind and stayed in France or maybe Switzerland before they were sent back. And let's talk a little bit as well about what it was like mentally for some of these Indians returning, especially from being in a POW camp and being a prisoner, escaping, and maybe the PTSD that came with this. So let's talk a little bit about what the time after the war for the POWs.
Yeah, difficult. So for the guys who were in Epinal, who were then in Switzerland, they basically got home by going on a train to Geneva, and then down to Marseille, and then to Italy by boat, to Egypt by boat, and then eventually to India. So they got home at the end of 1944, and they were still together as a group, and that was relatively easy for them, I think. And there's some good photos of them back in at home in India, but I think they had it relatively easy. But then we got all the rest of the Indian prisoners of war who were in camps across Europe, and they were liberated as the war went on. So in 1944 ended, and into 1945, camps in Germany or northern France that were liberated, and then these Indian prisoners of war all went to England, in fact, and then eventually back by ship to India. And it was difficult. I think there was always, yes, absolutely, this sense of kind of, you've missed the war, you've missed a lot of the war. You've been separated from your family and from everything familiar. And there were incidences of, yes, severe mental health crises. There were quite a few, and there were guys who were left behind. There's terrible stories about some, one poor soldier who was who ended up being liberated by the Russians, because he was way off in the east of Poland. He was liberated by the Russians and he died in hospital. And he was very, he wrote a terribly sad letter to his father before he died. And I think an enormous amount of suffering. An enormous amount of suffering at the end of the war. But then getting back home to India and the families. And slow integration, but a kind of a real sense of relief, an absolute sense of relief, and lots of stories about kind of embracing their mothers and fathers and kissing their feet, and how happy they were to be home again.
There's also, I remember, I want to mention this as well, there were also some soldiers who were just lucky to escape after the May 11th bombing, that had to stay behind, and as the liberation of France came, of course, the march were horrendous, and as we talked about at the end of the book, they were allowed to, because food was scarce. So in France, they were allowed to steal food and loot food as it came along. But when they were in Germany, that was different, because that was kind of home territory, because they were sent to POW camps in Germany. So let's talk a little bit about those who were left behind in the POW camps and who had to remain POWs for the rest of the war.
Yeah. Very difficult conditions for some of those, So for example, the camp that I talked about in northern Germany, the Milag Marlag, which was the camp for sailors, that camp wasn't liberated until I think April of 1945 by the British Army as it advanced through there. And they had very difficult conditions, and there were quite a few of these camps where they did, as you said, these marches where the Germans decided, rather than let the camp be liberated, they would try and march away all of these prisoners and take them further into Germany. So eastwards or westwards, depending on which army they were trying to get away from. And yeah, really, really tough conditions, and this was, so Lambsdorff is well known. Lambsdorff was a big Stalag 8B, a big camp in Poland. Thousands of Commonwealth prisoners, including some Indians, who had to march for days and days and days westwards toward, away from the Red Army and towards the center of Germany. And lots of guys were suffering on that march and starving or being killed by the Germans. But also on some other marches, also these marches were attacked by the Royal Air Force and the American Air Force by accident. They kind of saw these columns marching across, and actually there were quite a few prisoners who were shot, strafed from the air by the Air Force. So that's another terrible condition. So these conditions went on and on and on, and that kind of the middle of Germany, continued to be in very bad condition for several months until the end of the war, but even after the end of the war as well. Yeah,
so
really tough.
As well, talk a little bit about the home journey and how some integrated back into society. There were some who would later join the Free Indian Army under the independence, the new independent India and Pakistani armies. So let's talk a little bit about those soldiers who would later join the Indian Army. There were one Muslim soldier, I believe, who joined first the Indian Army and then later on would join the Pakistani army because he didn't feel like he advanced enough in the Indian army and wanted a decent career out of this. So let's talk a little bit those who actually chose to carry on their career as soldiers.
Yeah, and I think it was, kind of difficult, So some of them who had joined the German army, or indeed, kind of worked with the Germans, and then going home to the end of the empire, the end of the Raj, the last 2 years of the empire, without really, kind of nobody had any idea what was coming. Of course, no one had any idea what independence would look like. No one really knew what partition, the idea of Pakistan.
That is a whole other episode in itself.
Absolutely, a massive episode. That's completely. I mean, that's one of the things about history. We always look at it from now, but when you're in the middle of it, you've got no idea what's happening. You've got no idea what's coming. Yeah, so I mean, one of them, Anis Ahmed Khan, who was a captain at the beginning of the war. He was a captain in the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. He'd been trained at Sandhurst. He was a British kind of a British style Muslim Indian officer. I met his daughter when I was in Pakistan, lovely woman. And he was in a prisoner of war camp. In fact, he was in Colditz, among other camps. And Subhas Chandra Bose tried to recruit him into the German army, and he said no. And he said that he had tasted the king's salt. This was the expression, He tasted the king's salt, and therefore he owed his loyalty to the king, and he would never betray that loyalty, even though he was a nationalist, even though he was keen for independence. So he went back to he went back to India at the end of the war. Eventually, when his camp was liberated, and he rejoined the army. And in 1947, when the Indian Army was divided into becoming the Pakistan Army and the Indian Army, he decided to stay with the Indian Army. He decided to stay in India, even though he was a Muslim, and a lot of his Muslim comrades from his regiment were joined the Pakistan Army. So he joined the Indian Army. He became the Director of Supplies and Transport, which is a very senior position. But then later he changed his mind, and he went to Pakistan. So the very difficult decisions, very difficult, conflicts of loyalty. To who should I be loyal to? Should I be loyal to the king? Should I be loyal to my country? Should I be loyal to my religion? It really, and his example is an interesting example, but that happened many times for soldiers of all different levels and all different types. That question of loyalty.
Maybe special difficult for colonial armies, such as Indian soldiers or African soldiers, whereas the British soldier just have, oh, I have my country and my king, but I still have, like you said, so many different choices for the colonial troops who are fighting. Where is my loyalty? Who do I owe my loyalty to?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, and there's lots of examples of that. There's an interesting example with the Senegalese soldiers in France. How some of them at the end of the war were actually, attacked and massacred by the French, the colonial authorities. And how important that the process of that what happened during the war, how important that was in terms of the independence of French and British and other colonies in the post-war period, and how people had military experience, they'd been to Europe, they'd kind of had all kinds of new experiences, and then they said, okay, right, we need our independence. We have helped you, the Europeans, to liberate, and to get rid of Nazism. Therefore, we deserve to be independent and free ourselves.
So I think we're going to round it up there. Of course, this has been a great two-part episode. I really enjoyed this. And if you want to read more, if you cannot get enough of Indian colonial troops in the Second World War, you should read both the Indian contingent and the Great Epinal Escape, of course, because there's so much more. We only touched on the tip of the iceberg. So again, where can people find your books, and where are you on social media? And if people have further questions about both this and the previous episode they want to ask, where can they find you, and anything you want to promote or links in the description that you want to share? Well, now is the chance to promote your work.
Thank you, Alan. Well, I really like it when people get in touch. I'm really interested when people send me an email or a message on Twitter or whatever, because I'm interested in telling these stories and in broadening it, but I'm interested in the interaction. And part of that is that I've developed a database of names of Indian prisoners of war in Europe. And I've got about more than 12,000 of these guys. So I've collected their names from different archival documents. And in some cases, I've got photos of them or whatever. And so I would really I haven't yet found somewhere to put this database. But if there are people listening out there who, and let's face it, there were 2.5 million men in the Indian Army in the Second World War, 2.5 million. And if we think that those 2.5 million, maybe they got, let's say, 4 grandchildren each. That's 10 million. There's 10 million grandchildren out there who were connected to the Indian Army in the Second World War, and maybe they don't know anything about it. Maybe they've got like one letter or one old story from their grandfather, but they don't really know about it. So get in touch with me. Get in touch with me and also, ask me questions.
If you are new, you may see that I'm holding up the book right here because you have a list of the 500 Indian escapees. I don't know if you can see very well here, but you have a list of all the names of the escapees that I'm holding up right here, so you can find out the names of those from Epinal. And so absolutely check out this book. It's really an untold story, and a story that needs to be highlighted much more because it's such an important part of World War II history that hasn't been shown enough, both in film and in popular history as well. So it's a really wonderful story that needs to be told more. And if you are a Hollywood executive or a BBC executive that's listening to this episode, consider writing a script, read this book, or listen to this episode again, write a script, because this is really an epic story that needs to be a film or television series. Absolutely. So thank you so much for coming up on this podcast, for doing this 2-part episode that we made. I really hope you enjoyed it. I'm most certain enjoyed making it. And this has been Well That Aged Well. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars if you like this episode. If you are on Apple Podcasts, consider writing a review. If you are on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. Or also leave a comment both on Spotify and YouTube if you want me to cover more colonial or unknown World War II histories. Give me a shout out and I'll try to find more, because I love telling untold histories that need to be shown the light. So we are available on social media, all under the hashtag #WhatThatAgedWell, both on Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. So let's check us out there, and they do tweet some fun stuff, I like to think, as well. This has been my name is Alan. This has been What That Aged Well. I'll see you next time. There you go.